such a thank you, Ivana, for such a fantastic introduction. I feel flattered. And of course, I couldn't do anything but accept your invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here, albeit only virtually. And thank you to the organizers. I know how difficult it is to organize meetings during a pandemic, and I think you've done a fantastic job, and I look forward to attending all the cognition sessions later. So my talk today is about relations between cognition and perception, and I will talk about them through the prism of color categorization. As Ivana said, that is my main area of research. So to begin talking about relations between perception and cognition, probably it helps to first look at the percept itself. So if we think about color, if we think about the wavelengths of visible light, we can see each one of these wavelengths if we look at which color they are. They are many different colors, yet unlike, for example, the mantis shrimp, which has many detectors tuned to each of these stimuli separately, we only have 3 receptors. And through combining and contrasting signals between these 3 receptors, we essentially see color. So for example, by contrasting whether the L cone or the M cone are more excited, we can see whether something is more reddish or more greenish. By seeing whether the S cone is more excited compared to L or M cone, we can see whether something is more bluish or more yellowish. And by looking at the combined excitation from the L and M cones, we can see whether something, the overall amount of luminance contrast or achromatic contrast. So as you can see, our percepts are actually derived from a simple state of excitation from only 3 detectors. It's nothing to do with the categories that we may see in the visible light. Yet there is some organization to our percept. So as you can imagine, just thinking about color yourself, your percepts are organized. So hues are organized in a circular system where we actually also have certain opposites. So for example, blue and yellow are perceived as colors that can never be experienced together. There is no such thing as a bluish yellowish hue. They are opposites, same with green and red. And in the meantime, we also have, you can perceive the colorfulness or the lightness of a color. So from what may seem as a simple way of sensing wavelength content that is reflected from objects, we actually have a rather complex perceptual representation of color. Here, I've just disassembled that representation into hue on the horizontal axis and lightness on the vertical axis. And this would be like this set of Mansell chips that's often used in color categorization or psycholinguistic studies on color language. And if we now put onto this system of hues with different lightnesses, if we put color categories onto them, you can see that actually certain parts of this color space have a particular cognitive label associated with them. So for example, you can see that in the warm part of the spectrum, there are many categories, some lighter, some more darker, such as yellow or brown. And while in other parts like green or blue, that there's a more general label applied to all of them. But this is not the same for every language. So for example, in the Russian language and several other languages, there isn't a single word for blue, but there are actually 2 terms, one used for exclusively for the lighter shades and one for the more chromatic, darker shades. So this is quite interesting in itself when we think about the labels, but there are other phenomena that here are quite marked. So you can imagine that between these categories, there are some boundaries. So here I've sort of demarcated the red area as it bounds pink, orange, and brown. And then I've demarcated an orange area of the space. And now if we think about the colors at the boundary between red and orange, those colors, you know, compared to colors that may be equally far away perceptually, maybe there is something special there because there is also this cognitive difference. So those are certain colors that are very interesting from the perspective of cognition. Other colors that may be more interesting are focal colors. So those would be colors at the center of a category. So if you think about the most exemplary red or the most exemplary orange. So these focal and boundary colors are something quite interesting. And as you can imagine, color has often been used to evaluate cognition's influence on perception. There are several textbook level papers on color cognition that you will encounter when these relations between perception and cognition are discussed. And the reason for that is probably because color is the only perceptual continuum that is so readily divided into many categories. And also because color can be measured and quantified. There are many systems such as the Mansell system, which is a color ordering system, or CIE systems, which are the systems used to communicate color, but also in later versions of these systems like CIE-LAB, they are almost color appearance models that tell which colors are perceptually equally discriminable. So this idea that we can quantify color and control the stimuli and then look at effects of cognition has led to color cognition studies being very, very prominent in this cognition perception debate. To talk about it further, I think it's probably quite useful to first look at some of the behavioral signatures. So for example, if we did a study on some of these phenomena, what would we actually be able to measure? Here I'm showing a graph from one of the seminal studies by Bornstein and Korda. And you can see here that they manipulate stimulus using wavelengths in 2 wavelength steps from about 485 to about 500 nanometers. And they have 7 color samples. And they ask their participants to simply identify the color. And you can see on the y-axis in the blue and the green lines is the percent identification. So for initially 100% categorizations are that the color is blue. And at some point you can see for color sample number 4, this changes. So there is this sharp transition. So one signature of categorical perception is that the transition between categories, it's not smooth, it's actually quite sharp. Similar thing happens with phonemes in auditory perception. So there is this sharp transition at which point the color is neither here nor there. And you can see in the dashed line that the reaction time is much, much longer as participants, in a sense, try to decide whether this is blue or green. And after that, the color becomes green. So colors cross, the question here is what happens for these colors that cross the boundary? You would think that they have an additional categorical difference. So if we think about colors 3 and 5, in this example, which cross the boundary, colors 3 and 5 intuitively should seem more discriminable than equally distant colors that belong to the same category, such as colors 1 and 3, because they don't just have the same quantity in terms of whatever perceptual measure they're using here. It's just wavelength, which we will see later may not be optimal, but it seems that this extra difference, the cognitive difference, should create an additional perceptual discriminability advantage. And this is often measured in reaction time studies. So first of all, you may be asked to discriminate different colors. So for example, color 1 from color 3 or color 3 from color 5. And the idea is that color 3 and color 5, you should be more accurate and you should be faster because they are more different. So the studies I will tell you about today hopefully this introduction just gets you on board thinking about what is color perceptively, cognitively, and how do we measure it. And I will now discuss a few key studies in the color research that is relevant to this debate about relations between cognition and perception. And we will revisit these highly influential claims that are taken as strong evidence in favor of cognition's ability to penetrate perception. The first one will be the reaction time advantage for discriminating cross-boundary colors, but only when they are presented in the right visual field. So these studies basically use a visual search paradigm and show that not in the left, but only in the right visual field, you are faster across the boundary. And obviously the right visual field would be processed in the left hemisphere, allowing claims to be made about the primacy of language, in fact, as the modulating factor. The next study will be the reaction time advantage at the boundary of sinij and goluboj in Russian speakers, compared to a simple relative lightness distinction between light and dark blue in English speakers. So again, the fact that this is present in those participants who have the language distinction shows that language is a very strong modulator of the effect itself. And finally, I will talk about the acquisition of color categories, and we will compare how this happens for lightness and hue-based categories. The previous influential studies have claimed that this happens in a very similar way, which would again mean that the perceptual dimension doesn't really matter within the complexity of color perception, the dimensionality of it. It doesn't really matter. What simply matters is that once we equate the perceptual distances, categorization and acquisition of such categories operates uniformly. And for those who aren't too familiar with the cognitive penetration of perception debate, this is an ongoing debate going since the time of Fodor and Pilishin about whether perception is sort of encapsulated and separate from cognition, or whether cognition can change perception directly. And in most recent form, Firestone and Shaw have published a controversial paper challenging a lot of these findings that cognition can penetrate, or so to say, directly influence perception. And they raised the challenge that the studies basically have to show that they tested all sorts of alternative predictions, so also trying to eliminate the effect, not just to confirm it, whether this is really a perceptual effect rather than a simple judgment, which could have other biases. And then also talking of biases, that the bias could come from simply participants trying to figure out what the experiment is about and giving some socially desirable answers. Then for color, quite relevant, whether the low-level differences are really controlled or whether they may not have been controlled. Another relevant aspect is whether participants are maybe attending to another dimension than the one the experimenters think they are. And finally, effects of memory, which are also quite important and could modulate any of these effects simply inside, again, a bias resulting from memory. So we will look at these studies and discuss them in the end in this light of this debate. So the first study really is the important paper from Gilbert and colleagues about the Whorf hypothesis, or the hypothesis that language influences our perception is supported in the right visual field. So here, the experiment is used 4 color samples, which they defined in Mansell space, and the participants generally had the boundary between samples B and C. So they found 11 participants. So A and B would be green, C and D would be blue, but B and C, colors B and C cross this boundary. And then participants are simply doing a visual search task in which, let's say, A is the target, B is the distractor, or so forth. And we look at their reaction times. And when we compare the reaction times when it's within the category, which would mean A, B, or C, D, compared to when it's between the category, you can see from this graph that between category, there is an advantage in the right visual field, but not in the left visual field. This similar effect is reported in other studies. And obviously, talking of confirmation bias, if this is really coming from language, you should also be able to eliminate the effect by introducing verbal interference. And this is done by asking participants to memorize a sequence of digits, rehearse it while they do the each individual visual search trial, and then report the digits. So a classical verbal working memory load. And what is important, these studies found that the verbal interference removes this advantage. So Witzel and Gegenfurtner revisited these studies. So here you can see I've just replotted the results you've seen before. They are replotted with the y-axis a bit different, because when Witzel and Gegenfurtner actually tried to replicate these findings, they are more of a color vision lab rather than a cognition lab or a language lab. So they actually discovered quite different reaction times, much longer reaction times when they used simulated Mansell chips, which were correctly simulated. The RGB values reported in the previous study indicated that the simulation of the Mansell chips wasn't quite exact in the previous work. So you can see that with the simulated Mansell chips, there is a big cross-boundary advantage that's actually present both in the left and the right visual field, and without and with verbal interference. Now, in a more exact replication, when they use the RGB values provided by Gilbert and colleagues, you can see again that the cross-category advantage is present in both the left and the right visual field. So it's interesting that Witzel and Gegenfurtner found evidence of categorical perception in both visual fields. And the fact that this happens and doesn't really depend on verbal interference indicates that this may not be a result of language. In fact, it's quite unlikely that this is the result of language. And actually, Witzel and Gegenfurtner find that reaction times are slower for bluer colors than for grayer colors, and that this had inflated the reaction times in the within category, which includes bluish discriminations. And they suggest that reaction times may not be the best dependent variable when testing categorical perception, because if you think about how the color spaces were defined, they are defined by using non-speedy discrimination. And just because something is equally discriminable when you have all the time you need does not equate with how you might respond to it with speed, as that's not the variable on which it was controlled. And quoting from their paper, based on this data, the direct relationship between color categorization and hemispheric lateralization seems highly improbable and questionable. Okay, you might say, well, but there is that other influential study by Winawer and colleagues, which showed that in the Russian participants, there is an advantage, a reaction time advantage for dark and light blues, because they have the labels sinij and goluboj. So let's go over the methods of this study. In this study, participants were given a triplet of colors, and they come from this sample of color samples here. And you can see that they have 20 colors going from quite dark chromatic blue to quite a light blue. The sequential pairs were 2 steps apart, and participants had to do a task where they had to match which one of the colors, 2 colors below, is different from the color sample on top. So one is same, one is different. Once they performed this reaction time task on all of these color pairs above, they were given each individual color sample and asked to categorize it. And English participants would simply say whether it's dark or light blue, while Russian participants would say whether it's sinij or goluboj. The first finding is that the boundary between sinij and goluboj coincides really well with the boundary between light and dark blue. But what about the reaction times? So they extracted the reaction times across the boundary. So that would be the 2 colors next to the boundary and discriminations involving the boundary itself. and they compare it with color pairs on both sides of the boundary, taking 4 pairs each. And this is the result. So you can actually see that in Russian participants, there is a significant difference without any interference between cross and within category, with cross category being faster than within category. But this does not happen with English participants. And again, you can see that the verbal interference removes this effect in Russian participants, but the spatial interference doesn't. So this, you can see also the effect is really big. So it's a really big effect. And I must say, I started working on this topic because I had a Russian undergraduate student who wanted to replicate it for her undergraduate dissertation. And we assumed we would replicate it very easily. And when we failed to replicate it, this piqued our imagination. As it made us wonder, how can we not replicate such a strong effect? So things we observed. We again observed that the Russian speakers are much slower. You saw on the previous graph, they were much slower. And because we had many more trials for each individual color, we also found robustly slower reaction times when discriminating darker shades. And when you think about this, this makes sense. This is in accordance with Weber's law, because you are meant to make a discrimination on a much higher pedestal. So because they are both much darker than the background, their difference is smaller than for colors closer. Think, in a sense, if I ask you to discriminate 10 grams from 20 grams in each hand, as opposed to 110 versus 120 grams. The second one is much harder. And this got us thinking. If we think about these color samples and the reaction times for English and Russian speakers, and also think about the Witzel study where they actually showed that the within category effect was inflated by slower reaction times for blue. Well, one observation that is noted and very well known from previous research is that mean subject effects of independent variables are more pronounced in slower responders. So this offers an alternative account of Winawer's finding. So slower responding to dark blues by Russian speakers inflates reaction times in the within category conditions. So this is not so much an advantage for us cross category as an additional slowing, just simply due to them being slower. And this is obviously a testable hypothesis. So we proceeded to test it in our next study. So we conducted a follow-up study to our initial research, and we only could simulate 15 samples on our display reliably from the Winawer study. And we displayed it in 2 tasks. The first one was the categorization task. So that's the task they used as well. But we decided to use that task in 2 additional conditions with dark bias, meaning that the darker half of the samples, so samples 2 to 8, would be displayed twice as frequently as the lighter samples, and in the light bias, where it's the opposite. We displayed lighter colors more often than the darker colors. And this is because if we expected that maybe reaction time measures aren't perfect, well, we wanted to give a fair chance of observing some categorical perception, some advantage in Russian speakers by predicting that perhaps they should be more resistant to these effects of biases because they have a more firm, more categorical representation rather than the relative light or dark in English speakers. For our second task, we used the same reaction type task that was used in the previous study, just with more trials per color. Okay, so first I'll present to you the results just about the boundary. You can see where the Winawer boundary was. Our boundary is actually darker, considerably darker. There are 2 reasons for this. First of all, as you saw from my previous slide, I used the gray background. This is a default in my lab. And only after I corresponded with Jonathan Winawer, who was super helpful, gave me many we had a very useful discussion on the differences between our studies. I realized they use the white background. So as you can imagine, on a gray background, everything is going to look quite different, and things are going to start looking lighter much sooner than they would on a white background. Another important is the effect of range. So like the frequency of stimuli can affect how you categorize, so can the range. You can see we have a more restricted range, especially in the lighter part. So I'm showing you these results because they actually emphasize how relative the perception of categories based on lightness is. So relative to background and relative to range. Now let's look at our categorization results. First of all, you can see we have a somewhat sharper transition. This is the mean categorization of across all participants. So you can see on the x-axis are the 15 colors, and on the y-axis is the proportion of them saying that it's goluboj. So that means at 0 they are saying sinij, at 100 they're saying goluboj, or dark or light. And the Russian participants have a sharper transition. That's what you might expect. Now the effects of bias are interesting because in the Russian participants, the effect of bias simply shifts the whole curve to the left. But in the English participants, if you look at these colors 7 and 8, they are in both samples colors that transition where the boundary would be, so where you're at around 50%. But in English participants, when you see many dark colors, these two boundary colors become themselves much darker, and they sort of get absorbed inside this dark bias, but the same does not happen with Russian participants. So one could say that the controls are more affected by biasing when it's darker colors. Lighter colors not. So in lighter colors, we don't see a difference. And that's actually quite interesting because pragmatically, sinij and goluboj are asymmetric themselves. I will discuss that later. But first, let's look at the reaction times. As you can see, we get the difference in reaction times. Russian participants are slower. Bilinguals are often found to be slower in reaction time tasks due to having multiple representations that they're accessing. But there is no effect of boundary and no interaction by group. What about the effect of darker pairs? So you can see the darker pairs have higher reaction times in general, but here, because both of our participant groups are slower, so our Russian participants are actually as fast as the controls in Winawer, and our controls are even faster. They're fast enough for this clearly not to emerge into the data. We also did a follow-up experiment where we simply wanted to say, well, if sinij and goluboj are not as firm, and because they are relative categories, they depend on many other factors, how would they compare to a hue-based category difference simply in Russian speakers? So we conducted this study in a Moscow lab of my colleague Joe McInnes, and you can see this time I used the white background, and you can see on the white background that these same 15 colors are now, the boundary is now seen at a different step. So the boundary is now at a lighter color, and you can see that sinij bias and the goluboj bias shift the entire curve as what we saw before. But for goluboj green, or zeleny as in Russian, there is no effect of bias. So that's interesting, as it means that this boundary, the hue boundary, is more firm. We use the same steps in CIE, LAB space to equate the colors, so they should be perceptually equally discriminable. So, as you can see, the frequency biases give us some very interesting observations about the stability of the boundary. We do find some effects of categorical perception though, but these are in the accuracy categorization data rather than anything to do with reaction times. And so our conclusion would be that although lightness-based Russian categories sinij and goluboj are basic, they are not as distinct as hue-based categories. And actually, The fact that sinij in particular is a more robust category fits with the word frequency. It's a more frequent word, and it also fits with pragmatics of use because, for example, as we know, Russian blue cat, which is actually gray, and goluboj is also used to describe the color of pigeon feathers and the color of gray eyes very often. So it is also used, this word, as a more achromatic, in an achromatic sense. Okay, well, this is quite interesting and raises another question. How do we acquire maybe these color categories? And this is something that actually, when my paper that I talked to you about in Cognition was in review, our reviewers suggested that this is a very important study to look at because some of its findings may not go quite in line with what we find. And this is the paper by Özgen and Davies showing that we can simulate acquisition of color categories using perceptual learning, and that this learning is not too dissimilar between hue and lightness. The general approach in this type of studies is to train people on a new boundary. So this is similar to some of the studies actually conducted by my dear colleague Ivana Yakovlev. And so people are actually, part of the color space in this study, they take green. The part of the color space where you wouldn't have a boundary, you take it and then you teach participants, let's say, a new hue boundary. So you see, these are actually very similar samples, but on the left, it's a more yellowy green going towards a more bluish green. And you teach the participants that in the middle, there is a categorical distinction. Or you could teach them a lightness boundary. So between the darker pairs on the top and the lighter pairs at the bottom. And then you measure the accuracy of making within or between pair discriminations. And if learning of categories is based on a general mechanism, the acquisition of this learning should lead to perceptual advantage in discrimination, and this should work equally for both hue and lightness learning. So in the study of Özgen and Davies, they had 10 participants per group, and you can see their stimuli were taken from the Mansell space. And then they had the two sequences of learning. So the hue learners were taught the hue boundary and the lightness learners were taught the lightness boundary. First phase of learning was context dependent. So you would see a color sample in the middle, and then you had to decide whether you want to send it left or right. And then for each subsequent sample, you decide whether you want to send it left or right. And based on that decision, if you make the correct decision, it just goes there and sits there with the other samples. And if you make a wrong decision, there is a beep and the color disappears and you get the next sample. So nobody is really telling you, how this should work. There are no top-down cues. The cues are mainly perceptual. You get feedback and you have to extrapolate based on, that's why it's called perceptual learning. Once you have completed 20 minutes of such training and some criteria about how many you have to get correct and so on, you move on to no context learning. So in this learning, you now have this, exactly everything is the same, but you don't see the colors you've previously categorized, and you have to get at least 25 in a row correct. So it's quite stringent, and it shows that you have abstracted whatever the criterion is, whatever is the distinction between the categories, you've abstracted it sufficiently to complete this phase. And training groups come on the first day just to do training, and then come back on the second day, do a bit of top-up training, and then do a discrimination task, while the controls just get shown all the 16 colors to see what the stimuli are, and then they just do the main discrimination task. And this is the same different delay discrimination, where you see one color, there is a 5-second delay, and you see a second color. The second color is either the same or different, and it will only differ in one step. So for example, for hue discriminations, maybe this color versus this color, that would be a within category discrimination, or this color versus this color, that would cross the boundary. So you can see a pretty interesting design for testing this sort of predictions. And how does this relate to my previous study? Well, Özgen and Davies found in their paper, they report that categorical perception effects emerge both for the hue and the lightness boundary, however, not in the same way. Their hue learners actually seem to have acquired both, because they manifest categorical perception effects both at the hue and at the lightness boundary. But the lightness learners only manifested categorical perception at the lightness boundary. So you can see how this could be inconsistent with our findings, because if lightness color categories are less firmly demarcated, then they should be, you would think that they should be learned less efficiently than hue-based categories. So in a sense, they might have been harder to acquire rather than so easy to acquire that actually the hue learners acquire them incidentally as well. So based on the comments of the reviewers, we immediately started thinking about replicating this study too. And the question was, how does the learning process itself depend on the perceptual dimension that is being acquired? So as you saw, Özgen and Davies, they report the discrimination data, but they did not report the data, the mistakes made during learning, which could be indicative of what's happening while you learn. And so in my study, I not only collected discrimination data, but I also collected errors during learning and analyzed them. And I also asked participants if they had any particular labeling strategies at the end of the experiment. So we couldn't simulate exactly the same colors, but they were almost exactly the same. And here I am displaying the error rate. So they all sum up to 1. You can see the majority of errors should be congregate, and they are indeed congregating in the middle, 8 samples, but not evenly. There is an interaction. So the lightest sample away from the bluish greens seems to have led to the most mistakes. So clearly this is in line with Özgen and Davies' findings that hue learners are learning something about lightness too, not just about hue. But the lightness categorizer error rates also show an interaction, which means that certain lightness levels differ when they are different in hue as well. So you can see more errors on the greener side for the darker shade, but more errors on the bluer side for the lighter shade. So clearly these two dimensions are more integral, kind of like the Garner dimension integrality account, but both ways around, not just one way around. Labeling data is interesting too. We asked participants the following question: did you use any labels to refer to the colors while you performed the task? And the hue learners all reported using green and blue or green turquoise. Quite interesting considering that there was only a very small tinge of blueness and only really in the final row of the sample. And yet that's what they seem to have attended to while learning. Lightness learners, you might think they should all report light or dark or so on, but actually they seem to report a much wider range, including 3 of them who reported using hue-based categories, even though they were learning a lightness-based distinction. This is more in line with our interpretation that that boundary is more ambiguous. Now let's look at the discrimination data, and I will put the data for the 2 experiments side by side so we can compare them. First, Özgen and Davies. You can see from their controls, this is, first I'm showing hue discriminations, and each column is a different group of learners. We are showing A prime, which is a non-parametric measure of performance, kind of in between corrected hits and D prime. For lower values, it's more similar to D prime, and for higher values closer to 1, it's more similar to a corrected hit rate. So you can see the hue learners learned something about hue discrimination, the lightness learners didn't. What about my study? So I actually show 95% between subject confidence intervals, while they seem to show some sort of within subject intervals, so they have the same error bars for each group. But you can see my controls are fairly similar to their controls. The mean, their controls, the mean could come from the same distribution. So you can see I get the hue effect compared across is higher than within. So my hue learners learned something about hue, and my lightness learners didn't. So in that sense, I replicate their findings. Now let's look at lightness discrimination. Here's their controls. Hue learners learned something, but one thing important to note is that we didn't learn something so much when you compare across and within discriminations. This difference is very, very, very subtle. It's more when you compare against the across discriminations in controls, where they get significant effect because of how their controls are performing here. And you can see the lightness learners have a button across, so they have a more robust result here. In my sample, you can actually see my controls seem to slightly overperform their controls on across category discriminations. My hue learners didn't learn anything about lightness, and my lightness learners neither, although the effect goes in the right direction, it wasn't strong enough. I had 15 participants in the lightness group and 13 in the hue group. But I also had a second experiment, which I'm not showing here, but even when I collapsed data from 2 experiments, I did not get a lightness effect. So that means that the lightness effect is probably weaker and its strength was overestimated in the previous study. So in conclusion, the acquisition of color categories seems to depend both on the underlying perceptual dimensions of lightness and hue and on the existing categories that participants are applying during learning, so the labels that they are using to help themselves learn. Learning errors were not uniform, as one might predict. If participants are learning only one thing, they actually congregate along certain difficult regions that combine the dimensions. And these underlying perceptual representations are actually probably interacting with verbal labels in the sense that you might think about the Beschuld-Brücke effect, where lighter colors have more emphasis on their blueness compared to darker colors, which have a more emphasis on their greenness. And this has some subtle effects at actually perception of blue and green, depending on at which lightness level they are presented. So that's quite interesting, as it seems that how we attend to these labels seems to be shaping how we attend to certain important aspects of the perceptual space that we are given to work with. We replicated the hue cross-category advantage, but we failed to obtain the same advantage for lightness pairs. And this is in line with them being harder to acquire. So to bring all of this together, it seems to me now, having done these studies and having looked at the fantastic early work of Witzel and Gegenfurtner, without which I probably wouldn't have been able to do my own work, some of the previous evidence that shows strong effects of cognition on color perception are likely to stem from an overly confirmatory research strategy. And I don't mean in the sense that the authors did test whether it is verbal interference that removes the effect, but they didn't test necessarily all the predictions coming from perception that could have controlled for maybe some of what is in effect really important, the low-level differences. So, for example, between reaction times to blue and green, or between reaction times between darker and lighter shade. So these low-level differences are actually quite important, and we need to consider in each study about perception and cognition how they might affect what the explanation may be. They may actually cause the effect that we then interpret as a cognitive effect. But on the other hand, I must say, I do find the effects of categorical perception in Russian speakers with sinij and goluboj that are very highly interesting and speak for some effects of cognition on perception. But it's not so much that cognition affects perception. I would argue that it's more of my results put all together show that color categories are a product of mutual shaping between perception and cognition. And I would say that this mutual shaping is probably ultimately more interesting and inspiring for future research than a simple effect of cognition penetrating perception. And this is not something I've come up with. You know, always in research we are standing on the shoulders of giants. So I would like to finish my talk by a quotation from a fantastic paper by Regier and colleagues, where they discuss where color categories may come from. One possible explanation for universals in color naming is the irregular shape of the color space. Hue interacts with saturation and lightness to produce several large bumps. One large bump is at focal yellow and another at focal red. We assume that the names that get assigned to the color space are likely to be those names which are most informative about color. So I would like to thank you for staying with me, and I hope you found my talk interesting. I would like to thank my past funder DAD and my future funder the Royal Society, who will fund my work on color categories with DEG. And I